They told me to pray for a quick death if captured. They lied. It was late spring 1944, deep in the Louisiana Bayou. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of boiling crawfish, a scent both alien and intoxicating. Cajun voices, melodic and warm, sang over the sound of pots bubbling on open fires. Zydeco music, full of raw, joyful energy, spilled from a nearby porch. Laughter echoed across the camp fence, where a line of German prisoners of war, POW, stood motionless, eyes wide, faces drawn tight with a mix of hunger and sheer disbelief. On the other side of the wire, long tables were set beneath oak trees draped with Spanish moss. Crawfish, corn, sausage, and red potatoes, a blaze of color and scent, were poured out of steaming pots. The Cajuns laughed and clapped each other on the back as they cracked shells and raised beer bottles, the sound of pure, unbridled joy carrying effortlessly through the humid air. Inside the camp, Sergeant Major Klaus Richter, once a proud Wehrmacht tank commander, could hardly comprehend the scene. For months, he had been taught that Americans were savages, crude and violent, a nation of machines and greed. Yet here, just beyond the fence, they were celebrating like family, surrounded by children, laughter, and music. A young Cajun boy, no more than 12, looked up and saw the prisoners watching. He grinned and waved. "Come on, y'all. Ain't no harm in sharing." The guards froze. For a long second, no one moved. This was the line. Then one of the Cajun men, tall, broad-shouldered, his hands still red from the crawfish boil, nodded toward the sergeant. "They've worked hard all week," he said quietly. "Let him eat." The officer in charge, Lieutenant Mason, hesitated, his mouth pressed into a thin line, then gave a reluctant shrug. "All right, but keep it peaceful. Just one table." The gate creaked open, a sound that felt like the start of an execution. The Germans didn't move at first, uncertain whether this was a staged trap or a cruel joke. Then Klaus, driven by an instinct he couldn't name, stepped forward. His boots crunched on the gravel as he crossed the invisible line between war and something that felt almost human again. The Cajuns cleared space at the table. One handed him a tin plate. Another poured beer into a chipped mug. Klaus stared down at the food, red crawfish glistening in spices, steam rising into the humid air, and whispered, "This must be a trick." But it wasn't. As he sat among the people he once called enemies, the Zydeco music played louder, filling the space with its infectious rhythm. Children laughed, mesmerized as they watched the Germans fumble clumsily with the unfamiliar crawfish shells. One man, with kind eyes and a booming voice, clapped Klaus on the back and said, "Don't worry, soldier. You'll learn. First bite's always the hardest." The sergeant major smiled for the first time in months. Across the bayou, the sun dipped low, painting the sky gold and crimson. And in that moment, surrounded by strangers who actively refused to hate him, Klaus Richter realized he had stepped into a kind of peace he'd never known, one born not of treaties or victory parades, but of simple, radical human decency. Months before that day in Louisiana, Klaus Richter had stood in a ruined Tunisian village, watching Allied aircraft hammer German positions until the ground shook beneath his feet. His commanding officer had spat the words, "If you are captured by the Americans, pray they shoot you quickly. They treat prisoners like animals." That single, chilling lie had been the only baggage he carried all the way across the Atlantic. When the transport ship finally reached the Gulf Coast, Klaus expected cages, starvation, perhaps even torture. The propaganda had been so vivid, so terrifying. The films had shown Americans as crude, undisciplined, a mob with rifles and no honor. But when the guards opened the ship's gate, he found himself standing not before monsters, but farmhands. The first man he saw wore a Stetson hat and, impossibly, a smile. The truck ride to the camp passed through cypress swamps, glowing an eerie, humid green. He smelled sugarcane and smoke, heard laughter from children on porches as the convoy rolled through small towns. It was all too normal, too human, and that terrified him more than any threat of violence. Inside the camp, he was issued a clean uniform, soap, and 3 abundant meals a day. The barracks had bunks, windows that opened, even books in German. The guards addressed the prisoners as men, not numbers. Each morning began with coffee, hot coffee, and rolls of fresh bread baked by local women. Klaus found it utterly impossible to square what he'd been told with what he saw. The American devils were courteous. The machines of democracy ran with terrifying efficiency, but also a chilling fairness. No one shouted. No one beat them. The worst punishment he ever saw was being assigned to extra cleaning duty. He began to write the first words in a small notebook he'd kept hidden since Africa. Either the Reich lied, or America hides its cruelty well. That evening, one of the Cajun guards, Corporal Antoine Boudreau, sat by the fence strumming a guitar. The melody was strange, mournful, almost like a lullaby floating on the Bayou air. Klaus approached, unsure if it was allowed, bracing himself for a reprimand. Boudreau glanced up. "You ever hear Cajun music, Fritz?" Klaus shook his head, his throat suddenly dry. "It's like us," the guard said, his voice low. "Half French, half lost, all heart." He laughed softly, tuning a string. "You boys think we hate you. Truth is, we don't even know you." That night, as frogs croaked and insects hummed in the bayou darkness, Klaus couldn't sleep. He kept hearing that line, a phrase that felt like a challenge. "We don't even know you." He realized that the myths of hate only worked when two sides stayed strangers. And here, behind the barbed wire, strangers were starting to look like people again. For the first time since capture, he wondered if, maybe, just maybe, everything he had believed about the war was wrong. By the summer of 1944, Louisiana had become one of the largest centers for holding Axis prisoners of war in the United States. The Army built sprawling camps in places like Camp Ruston, Camp Claiborne, and Camp Livingston, remote enough to keep prisoners contained, yet close enough to rail lines and the farms that desperately needed hands. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment for all POWs. But what unfolded in Louisiana went far beyond mere compliance. The Cajuns, with their deep Catholic roots and old-world hospitality, treated the German prisoners less like enemies and more like wayward cousins. It was a cultural instinct: feed first, question later. The POWs worked the land, sugarcane fields, sawmills, and rice farms that stretched across the humid parishes. They rose at dawn, marched to the fields under the watchful eye of local guards, and returned in the evening covered in sweat and mud. Yet, even in labor, there was dignity. They were paid in camp script they could use at the canteen for cigarettes, soap, or postcards. Klaus learned his first English words from those small, vital purchases: coffee, bread, thank you. He began to trade phrases with the locals, finding their Cajun French easier to understand than the clipped English of the soldiers. The guards laughed good-naturedly at his accent, and soon they were trading jokes across the work site. Camp Ruston, where Klaus was sent, was not a place of despair, but of strange, unprecedented coexistence. A baseball field sat behind the barracks, baffling the European soldiers. A small orchestra had formed German violins and Cajun accordions, blending into a harmony that no one expected to hear in wartime. At night, the prisoners built model ships and chess sets out of scrap wood. Some even painted murals on the barracks walls, pastoral scenes, forests, and the cities they longed to see again. To the Americans, it was harmless creativity. To the Germans, it was a way to feel human again. The Cajuns were fascinated by the POW's discipline. "They line up like they still got an officer watching," one guard joked. But what impressed them most was how quickly the Germans adapted, how they fixed engines, repaired fences, or taught woodworking to local boys. Sometimes, curiosity turned into quiet respect. One local farmer, Old Man Thibodeau, used to bring a jug of sweet tea to the field where Klaus's crew worked. "You'll fight a big war," he'd say, handing out cups. "But out here, the only war is against the heat." Klaus couldn't forget that line. It was the first time anyone had spoken to him as a man, not as an enemy. Still, every night when the floodlights came on, the barbed wire shimmered like silver in the darkness, a reminder that this peace was temporary, conditional, fragile. In his diary, Klaus wrote, "America fights its wars with decency. That is its strength and our undoing." He didn't yet know that soon, decency would take its most shocking form, an invitation no prisoner could have imagined. And it would come not from generals or high-ranking officers, but from the Cajuns themselves. By autumn 1944, the U.S. government had spent over $1 billion maintaining more than 400,000 Axis prisoners in the continental United States. The number sounded absurd even to Americans. A war fought on two oceans, yet still finding money to feed, clothe, and house the enemy. For the Germans behind the wire, it was unthinkable. Klaus once overheard a young American officer reading from a newspaper at the mess hall. Each POW costs roughly $1.80 a day, more than an American school child's lunch. The room fell silent. Even the guards looked embarrassed, but the officer only shrugged. "That's the price of being civilized," he said, his voice flat. The line burned into Klaus's mind. Civilization. That word felt heavier than any weapon. In the Reich, prisoners starved. In the bayous of Louisiana, they received buttered bread and sweet corn. At first, Klaus saw it as propaganda in reverse, the Americans showing off their wealth, proving superiority through kindness. But the longer he stayed, the less it felt like a performance. It was just how they lived. He began to notice how everything around him ran on abundance, not arrogance. The mess hall never ran out of flour. The guards had new uniforms. Trucks brought in food every few days, supplies stacked with military precision. When he spoke to Corporal Boudreau about it one afternoon, the Cajun laughed. "This ain't special treatment, Fritz. This is just Tuesday." Klaus didn't understand. How can a nation waste so much? Boudreau squinted against the sun. "It's not waste, it's plenty. We build more than we need so no man goes hungry. That's the American way." That conversation gnawed at Klaus. He thought about Germany, its ration books, its propaganda, promising final victory even as cities burned. He remembered his mother writing about long bread lines in Hamburg, about neighbors disappearing for whispering doubts. And here, his captors not only fed him but gave him dignity. One evening, Klaus sat outside the barracks and watched as a truck from town arrived at the gate. A few Cajun women unloaded baskets of fresh vegetables and smoked meat. One carried a basket of eggs wrapped in newspaper and handed it to the guards with a note. "For the boys." When the guards asked who the boys were, she simply said, "All of them. Doesn't matter what side they're on." That night, the camp kitchen served bacon and eggs. Klaus couldn't eat. His hands trembled as he stared at the plate, not from fear, but from shame. How could a defeated enemy be fed better than the soldiers still fighting for the Reich? His diary entry that night was simple. If mercy is a weapon, then America has mastered war. What Klaus didn't realize was that this generosity was about to cross an even more astonishing line, from policy to a personal invitation. And it would happen in a way so humble, so human, that it would haunt him for the rest of his life. It began, as many things in Louisiana do, with food. On a humid April afternoon, the guards came to the barracks and announced a work rotation near the bayou. A small crew of German POWs, including Klaus, would help a local family mend their dock. Nothing unusual. But when they arrived, the air was thick with a different kind of smell. Boiling spices, smoke, meat. The Thibodeau family, Cajun to the bone, were hosting a crawfish boil. It was Saturday, the workday done, and by the river stood tables piled high with red crawfish, corn, and sausage. At first the Germans didn't understand. They lined up, waiting for orders. Klaus whispered, "Is this another test?" Then one of the Cajuns, a burly man with a grin like sunlight, waved them over. No, you work. You eat." The prisoners hesitated. They weren't sure if it was a joke. The guards didn't intervene. They just nodded, smiling quietly. Klaus took one cautious step forward. The Cajun handed him a steaming crawfish and mimed how to twist the tail. "You pinch, you pull, you eat," he said, his French-laced English thick. The German officer next to Klaus frowned. "Eat this?" he asked in broken English. "May we?" The man laughed, a big, hearty sound. "Mais non, go ahead." And then it began the strangest meal of Klaus's life. The POWs sat beside the very men who guarded them. They wiped their hands on shared napkins, laughed at the spice burning their tongues, and listened to accordion music drift through the cypress trees. Children ran between the tables, offering bottles of Coca-Cola to anyone with an empty cup. For a moment, the war disappeared. One of the older Cajun women asked Klaus through broken French if he had family back home. He nodded. A wife. A son. She pressed a piece of cornbread into his hand and said softly, "Then eat, so you can see them again." He didn't know what to say. No one in Germany, no one had ever spoken to him like that since the war began. Across the table, Corporal Boudreau lifted his glass and said, "To the day when we can all go home." The toast echoed through the humid air, half in English, half in German, entirely in disbelief. Klaus's fellow prisoners sat in stunned silence. Then one of them, a former SS sergeant named Werner, laughed the first true, unrestrained laugh Klaus had ever heard from him. When the meal ended, the prisoners offered to help clean up. The Cajuns refused, waving them off. "You're our guests," they said simply. As the sun set over the bayou, the camp truck arrived to take them back. Klaus looked out the window as the fields rolled past. His hands still smelled faintly of spice and smoke. He wrote in his diary that night, "They call us enemies, but today I saw no enemies, only men who have not forgotten what it means to be human." The next morning, word of the Cajun feast spread through the camp like wildfire, and with it came something far more powerful than propaganda: belief. By the following week, the camp was buzzing with quiet disbelief. The Germans had spent years believing that Americans were monsters, materialistic, cruel, godless. Yet, what they'd seen in that Cajun backyard didn't fit any of those stories. It was not strategy. It was not an order from a general. It was simply kindness, the kind that broke men without drawing blood. Klaus sat on his bunk that night, staring at the half-eaten cornbread he'd hidden in his pocket from the feast. He couldn't bring himself to throw it away. It wasn't just food anymore. It was proof. Proof that the Reich had lied. Proof that the enemy had more humanity than the empire he had sworn to serve. He began to write, though he knew his letter would be censored. "My dear Martha," he began, "the Americans do not starve us. They feed us until we cannot eat. They do not mock us. They laugh with us. The children bring us sweet drinks, Coca-Cola they call it, as if we are uncles, not prisoners. I don't understand this country. They fight with power, but they win with decency." That letter, like hundreds of others written from POW camps across America, was quietly passed through military censors and sent to homes across Germany. The words reached kitchens and churches, whispered in marketplaces and train stations, carried like smuggled truth across a collapsing nation. Each letter became a small rebellion against the Reich's machine of hate. The numbers told the same story. Over 425,000 Axis POWs in the U.S. spread across 511 camps. They built roads, harvested crops, repaired fences, and ate 3 meals a day that would have been luxuries in wartime Europe. It was expensive. Yes, the United States spent over $1.8 billion feeding and housing its enemies. But in that staggering number lay something immeasurable: moral superiority. Klaus didn't have those figures, of course, but he could feel them in the air. In the easy laughter of his guards, in the endless supplies from the commissary, in the quiet confidence of a nation that didn't need cruelty to prove its strength. One night, while repairing a wooden crate near the kitchen, he overheard 2 guards talking about the Cajuns. "Crazy folks," one said, shaking his head. "Feeding the enemy like that?" The other guard just grinned, wiping his hands on a rag. "Maybe that's how you end a war, not start one." That line lodged itself deep in Klaus's chest. The next morning, he wrote in his journal, "We thought victory came from fear, but here I see victory in generosity." Every day afterward, he began to look differently at the world outside the wire. The bayou no longer looked foreign. It looked like a place where survival and compassion could coexist. But deep down, he knew the day of reckoning was coming, when the war would end and every lie he'd been told would fall apart. And when that day came, it would not be a bullet or a bomb or a battle that broke him. It would be the simple truth that his enemy had taught him how to be human again. The mail truck came every 2 weeks. For the German prisoners, it was the most important event in the camp, a brief, fragile connection to the world they'd left behind. When the guards called names, the men stood straighter, their accents thick with nervous hope. Some received envelopes thin as air, others nothing at all. But every man, no matter his rank, was allowed to write. Klaus waited until late one night to compose his letter. The barracks were quiet, except for the hum of cicadas and the low murmur of men whispering in their bunks. He sat at the small wooden desk near the window, the same one they used to log work assignments, and began to write in deliberate, careful script. "My beloved Martha," he wrote, "if I could show you this place, you would not believe me. They say we are prisoners, yet I have eaten better here than I did at home. The Americans feed us meat, bread, even eggs. They let us listen to their music. And yesterday, the people from the village invited us to a meal beside the river, not as enemies, but as men. It is as if the war does not exist here. If this is defeat, then it is a defeat filled with mercy." He hesitated, wondering if such honesty might be censored, but he continued anyway. "The men here, they smile. Even the guards joke with us. They say their mothers and wives are praying for peace. Sometimes I think they mean it." That letter made its way through military channels, stamped and opened by American censors, then carefully resealed and shipped across the Atlantic with thousands of others. When Martha finally received it, she read it 3 times before daring to show anyone. The neighbors didn't believe her at first. The Reich's newspapers called the Americans savages. But Klaus's handwriting was unmistakable, his tone unmistakably human. Soon, other letters arrived from other camps from Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and Louisiana. Each told the same story: good food, fair treatment, even friendship. The Gestapo monitored these reports, uneasy but powerless to stop them. The truth was leaking out through kindness. Months later, Martha wrote back, "Klaus, your words have spread among our church friends. They cannot believe it, but they say it gives them hope that maybe the world is not lost." Back in Louisiana, Klaus sat under the oak trees near the workyard, reading her reply with trembling hands. He looked around at the camp, the guards joking, the distant laughter of children from the nearby village, and realized something profound. The war was ending, not with the collapse of cities, but with the collapse of hate. In his next letter, he wrote only one line: "Tell our son that America is not what they told us. Tell him that mercy is stronger than fear." Those letters, multiplied across thousands of POWs, became the quietest act of resistance against tyranny the world had ever seen. No propaganda, no leaflets dropped from planes, just words of truth from men who had eaten at the tables of their former enemies. And for Klaus, that letter marked a turning point, not just in the war, but in his soul. The next chapter of his story would not be written with ink or food. It would be written with a handshake, one that erased the last trace of hate. A few weeks after the crawfish boil, the sound of a truck engine echoed through the Louisiana camp again. The prisoners looked up from their morning chores, expecting another supply run or a new work order. But when the dust settled, it wasn't a convoy or an officer. It was the Cajun. Jean-Pierre Thibodeau stepped out of his old pickup wearing the same wide grin, his hat tipped back against the sun. In his hands, he carried a basket wrapped in checkered cloth. The guards didn't stop him. They knew him by now, the man who had somehow turned a camp full of enemies into dinner guests. He walked straight to the fence where Klaus and the others stood. "Bonjour, mes amis," he called out. "Thought you might be hungry again." The prisoners laughed softly, half in disbelief. Inside the basket were glass jars, homemade preserves, apple butter, pickled vegetables, simple gifts from a man who owed them nothing. Klaus approached the fence slowly, still unsure if kindness this pure could be real. Jean-Pierre slid one of the jars through the wire, saying, "You boys don't forget. This war will end. Keep your heads high." Klaus looked at the jar in his hands. The glass was warm from the sun. It felt like holding something human, something fragile, something he hadn't known since the world fell apart. He looked up. "Why?" he asked quietly, his voice rough. "Why do this?" Jean-Pierre shrugged, the gesture effortless. "Because when this is over, you'll go home. And I want you to remember, not all Americans wore uniforms." The other prisoners gathered near, silent. Even the guards paused, leaning on their rifles, watching. The world seemed to stop for a moment. No fences, no flags, no sides. Klaus hesitated, then reached through the wire. His hand, calloused from years of work and war, met Jean-Pierre's strong, warm, steady. They shook hands. No words, no translation needed. That handshake became the moment everything changed. For Klaus, it was the first time he'd willingly touched an American. For Jean-Pierre, it was the quiet victory of a man who didn't need a rifle to win a battle. When the Cajun turned to leave, Klaus called out, "Merci." It was one of the few French words he knew. Jean-Pierre laughed, waved his hat, and drove away into the fading light. The prisoner stood there long after the truck disappeared, the sound of its engine fading into the swamp's quiet hum. That night, Klaus couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the scene in his head. The handshake, the sunlight, the laughter. He realized that something had shifted. The barbed wire no longer looked like a cage. It looked like a border between the past and the future, between hate and understanding. In his journal he wrote, "Today, a man who could have hated me chose not to. I think I will remember his hand more than any order I ever followed." When morning came, he placed the jar of preserves on his bunk. He didn't open it. He didn't have to. It wasn't food anymore. It was proof that even in captivity, freedom could still exist, if only in the heart. By spring of 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing. The newspapers pinned to the camp bulletin board told the story in broken headlines. Berlin encircled, Allies advance, Reich on the brink. But inside the Louisiana compound, something far quieter was happening. The prisoners who had once marched under swastikas now lined up each morning, not with pride, but with humility. Klaus had stopped asking when he'd be released. The question no longer mattered. What mattered was what he would carry home when it finally came. Not the rations, not the clothes, but the truth. He sat on the steps of the barracks one humid evening, the Cajun's jar still unopened beside him. A guard walked by, offered him a cigarette, and asked in a casual tone, "You boys ever think about what you'll do when you get back?" Klaus smiled faintly. "I think," he said slowly, "we'll have to learn everything again." He didn't mean language or trade or even freedom. He meant decency, the kind he'd seen practiced here without ceremony, without ideology, just quiet respect, born from abundance and confidence. Weeks later, a new order came down. Germany had surrendered. The camp went silent. Some men cheered, some cursed, some cried. Klaus didn't move. He simply stood and looked at the sky, knowing that the war outside had ended long after the one inside him had. He opened his journal for the last time and wrote, "They called them cowboys. We called them fools. But it turns out the fools were us. They fought us with machines, yes, but they conquered us with mercy." In the days that followed, trucks arrived to begin the long process of repatriation. As the prisoners were counted, processed, and prepared for departure, local families brought small gifts to the fence: bread, apples, even handwritten notes. One woman, an old Cajun matron with skin like river driftwood, handed Klaus a small cloth bag and said, "For your wife. Tell her Louisiana forgives you." Inside the bag were biscuits and a tiny wooden carving of a dove. Klaus bowed his head and said softly, "Danke." When the final roll call came, the men of the camp lined up one last time. The guards, many of them young farm boys from the south, stood a little straighter than usual. There were no jeers, no orders barked, no displays of power, just nods, handshakes, and the occasional clumsy smile. As Klaus climbed into the truck, he saw Jean-Pierre waiting by the road. The Cajun lifted his hand in a lazy salute. Klaus mirrored the gesture, and for a moment it was as though two worlds, the conqueror and the conquered, had met halfway. Years later, long after he had returned to a shattered Germany, Klaus would tell his son about that moment. "They taught us that strength comes from obedience," he said. "But the Americans? They showed me that real strength comes from choice, from choosing to be kind when no one expects it." The boy asked, "Did they forgive you?" Klaus smiled, eyes far away. "They didn't have to," he said. "They never hated us in the first place." That became the verdict of a war fought across oceans. Not just who won, but who remembered to stay human. And in that, the cowboys had been the true victors all along. They called them prisoners, but by the time the trucks rolled out of Louisiana, they looked more like men leaving home than captives returning from war. The barbed wire stayed. The guard towers stood empty. But what lingered in that red clay soil was something greater than victory: understanding. Klaus carried only a few things with him: his worn notebook, the unopened jar of preserves, and a single word he'd learned from the cowboys. Neighbor. He never forgot that word. Not after the ruins of Germany. Not after the hunger. Not after rebuilding his life. Years later, when his own son asked what America was like, he didn't speak of guns or guards. He said it was a place where enemies shared a meal, and for a moment, the world was sane again. The story of the Louisiana POW camp became a quiet legend, one of the few chapters of war where mercy triumphed over revenge. It proved that the real power of America wasn't in its factories or fleets, but in its ability to turn a battlefield into a barbecue and prisoners into people. They mocked the cowboy once. He fed them instead. History remembers wars for who won. But sometimes the truest victory belongs to those who chose kindness when cruelty was easier.